Wishing to form a better and more efficient system of operations in his own American automobile factories in Detroit, Michigan, Henry Ford introduced several inventions and policies that created a more efficient production of his Ford Model T, including his innovation of the assembly line in 1913 and his $5 a day wages in 1914. This philosophy triumphed by earning Ford more sales and profit, as well as creating a bond between Ford and his workers, with each side feeling satisfied. However, this philosophy was not without flaw and certain tuned to tragedy, as there grew tensions between Ford and his workers over their treatment in the factory, which led to strikes in the 1930s between Ford and his workers. The period between the late 1800s and the early 1900s proved to be a strong catalyst for new ideas to flourish, especially new business philosophies. The 20th century in the United States began with a boom. Massive amounts of immigrants came to the U.S. in hopes of finding better lives. Ideas of progressivism began to arise, with reform being on the mind of many Americans. An increase in invention and innovation led to better production of manufactured goods. American industry continued to grow, now with more immigrant laborers to take factory jobs, and due to all these factors, urbanization exploded. Cities in the East and Midwest United States experienced the full force of urbanization, one of these cities being Detroit, Michigan. An influx of immigrants starting in the late 19th century brought people to the United States that sought work and a home. Detroit offered these desires to immigrants, and thus many moved to the city, eventually making it the 9th largest city in the United States. Detroit housed a growing metal industry, including the production of rail cars, iron, and brass. As time progressed into the new millennium, a newer industry began to take over the well-established immigrant city of Detroit and its factories, the automobile industry. The rise of automobile companies in Detroit brought the laborers working in the city factory jobs, which led to a better standard of living and a richer city as a whole. But while all the automobile companies contributed to Detroit's wealth and prosperity, none had much of an impact as Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford's business philosophy triumphed under his ideas of maximizing efficiency in the workplace, increasing output and decreasing prices of product, and funding laborers so they could act as consumers themselves, which positively impacted the United States. In 1869, Henry Ford began work on his first automobile in Detroit, known as the quadricycle. After many years of perfecting his craft of automobile manufacturing and being determined to create a motor car for the great multitude, he found success with his introduction of the Ford Model T in 1908 under the Ford Motor Company name, releasing it to monumentous success. The public loved the Model T, beginning right at its conception with its sturdy build quality and, especially, the price. Before the Model T, automobiles were too expensive for the working class to afford. Ford managed to sell 720,000 Model Ts by 1916 due to its affordable price. Not only were people praising Ford's automobile, but they also praised Ford himself, with some people claiming he had a spectacular idea and can be credited with popularizing the automobile as a whole. Henry Ford was a proponent of maximizing efficiency in the workplace. His ideas on how the workplace should operate draw close inspirations from a previous idea about maximizing efficiency in the workplace known as Taylorism. Frederick W. Taylor, a foreman in a New York steel factory, was one of the first people who applied scientific management to workers to improve their efficiency. Inspired by Taylor's ideas on efficiency in the workplace, Ford sought to find his own ways of improving the efficiency of his workers by innovating upon the assembly line. On Ford's assembly line, a Model T would be pulled by a hook and winch across the line, passing men who would add their sole part to the product, repeating the cycle up to 9,000 times per day at its peak. Ford can now produce hundreds and later thousands of Model Ts a day, with each one's chassis production time going from 12 hours to an hour and a half. Ford believed that by making one person do only one task, it could result in the reduction of the necessity for thought on the part of the worker and the reduction of his movements to a minimum. While all was well for Ford and his shareholders, not all was well for his workers, who had to work under harsh conditions, repeating a single action thousands of times for 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. These workers were also paid less than skilled workers at the time, only earning $2.34 a day wages, on par with most other factory wages. Workers were also expendable, as the labor needed required little skill, thus workers could lose their jobs for making minor mistakes. But all was not bad for the laborers. On Christmas in 1913, James Couzens, a shareholder and vice president of the Ford Motor Company and one of Ford's closest acquaintances, consulted Ford and demanded that workers be paid a $5 a day minimum wage for an 8-hour workday, which Ford was initially against. Couzens was able to persuade Ford to accept the wage increase and hour decrease, with Ford later claiming that he did so to benefit his workers rather than himself. Ford may have accepted the offer due to his good nature, but he also saw a benefit on the business side of the offer. These better wages allowed workers to live better lives and, in return, spend money on products like Ford's own Model T. Ford's producers thus became his consumers, which earned him more profit. The news of the wage increase, being nearly double the wages at the time, spread to all corners of the United States, from other businesses to laborers. The outlook on the new wage seemed to hint at a positive future for the company and industry as a whole, with many people praising Ford and his actions. While Henry Ford's business philosophy triumphed through its many stages of action, it also led to tragedy due to those same actions. All seemed peaceful for the Ford Motor Company in January of 1914, but that peace was brief. The day after Ford's announcement, 10,000 men appeared at Ford's factory, ready to obtain jobs at the factory. Ford, only able to accept 5,000 of them, was forced to turn many away. He later stated that only men who had lived in Detroit for 6 months were eligible for the jobs, which turned many job seekers away. Not only did the new wages immediately disrupt the workforce, but it also disrupted the business world. Due to the Ford Motor Company's new standings, other companies were forced to follow suit, with the president of the Packard Motor Company, Alvin McCauley, saying, "What is the use? We can't compete with an organization like the Ford Motor Company." This stirring of the business world sent many business owners against Ford, making such claims as that it would spell the ruin of all business in this country. Ford's impressive wages were praised by onlookers and consumers, but were much more complicated for his workers. Ford, a man against poor habits such as drinking and gambling, felt worried that his workers would abuse their extra pay for these acts rather than for buying his own product. Thus, he began to inspect the lives of his workers, only giving the $5 a day wages to those he deemed worthy. Everybody else would earn the previous $2.34 a day wage. Critics of this practice are quoted as saying, "The men were entitled to the money, and, having earned it, it was theirs to spend without answering the snooping questions of investigators." The company's situation and tragedy appeared to plateau over the next year, with Ford gaining praise for his institution of an English school for his foreign employees and a steady flow of doctors and nurses in his factory to tend to any injured worker. World War I was nearing reality in 1916, and due to war inflation, the $5 a day wages had to be stopped, thus depriving Ford's workers of what he wished to provide them. After Cousin's departure from the company, Ford decided to expand his company further into a new factory, to be named the River Road plant, and lower costs of the Model T even more. While this idea seemed great to Ford, it did not sit well for his shareholders, chiefly the Dodge brothers, as Ford would use their dividends to the creation of the factory. After the Dodge brothers brought suit against Ford in 1916, Ford defended his actions by stating it would not only give benefits to the workers and consumers, as the cost of Model T would be lowered, but it would also benefit himself and his shareholders as they would gain a larger profit. In the end, in 1919, the court ruled in favor of the shareholders. Ford was denied his chance to expand his company by the court, which forced him to operate as his shareholders wanted. This event, according to Ford, did not let him operate his business as he saw fit, and thus he resigned as president of the company, putting his son Edsel Ford as president. While Ford still continued to operate with his company after his resignation, his philosophy had fallen apart. The philosophy that he once cherished and followed directly led him to the demise of the philosophy itself. Henry Ford's business philosophy continued the actions it once took in the original Ford factory. However, they were now being challenged by laborers who grew unhappy with the treatment they were getting. Ford's company continued to prosper after his resignation, overseeing the opening of production plants in Edgewater, New Jersey, in Chester, Pennsylvania, and the River Road plant he intended to open before he resigned. However, these plants differed from the original factory at Highland Park. Men were worked to their absolute maximum efficiency at these factories, with little breathing room in between their constant tasks. If workers were caught for even a second doing an action that was not productive, they could risk working extra hours, losing their pay, or in some cases, losing their job. All of these poor working conditions led to a rise in unions and strikes, and thus on May 26, 1937, after strikes occurred at the Chester and Edgewater plants, representatives for the United Automobile Workers spoke with reporters and posed for photographers as they waited for the shift change at the Rogue plant. In the meantime, several men, including Ford Motor servicemen, ordered the representatives to leave. The dispute quickly turned into brutal fighting. This battle, known today as the Battle of the Overpass, depicted Ford and his policy on labor unions as unethical and unfair. Thus, the National Labor Relations Board forced Ford not to interfere with his labor unions again. Ford, under order by the law, was forced to act for his workers entirely, even if that meant supporting plots against him. The business philosophies once popularized by Ford largely fell apart after Ford's resignation and the labor strikes. Despite this, some of the ideas have resurged in history, proving they can be beneficial if used for the right causes, with them still existing today. Ford's idea of maximizing efficiency through scientific management proved vital to the U.S.'s success in World War II. As most factory jobs did during the war, Ford factories switched from assembling cars to assembling planes, ambulances, and trucks, as the war proved to be in desperate need of product. A bomber plant named Willow Run was created by the U.S. government solely for Ford to put his massive production into. Ford's efficiency proved to be valuable to the whole of the U.S., as other automobile factories in Detroit joined in on the effort, eventually making 1/8 of the weapons speeding the day of victory the production of Michigan factories. The success of the United States in battle may not have been so successful if Ford's ideas of mass production and efficiency had not been put to use. Ford's philosophy, now called Fordism, continues to help industry and manufacturing today, as his methods of efficiency are present in today's factories, with many of them using a form of the automated assembly line. Ford's delegation of factory jobs to workers has also been kept around, with modern factory workers only conducting a small number of tasks for their jobs. A growing desire for efficiency has resulted in the persistence of Fordism-like ideas to be present in factories today. Ford's actions have been credited as catalysts for a rise in the United States middle class, which may not have been as successful if automobiles and cheaper products had not reached the market. Fordism has proved to be a major factor in the success of America, and its ideas may never be totally forgotten.